All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar today. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Let me get these settings on here correctly. Just a couple quick housekeeping items. We have everybody muted, cuts down on a lot of background noise. So if you have a question as we go through this, there's a dialog box within the Zoom component there where you signed in. You can post questions. We'll also give you some contact information when we wrap up in a little bit. So if you have questions, want to give us a call, shoot us an email. Happy to answer any of those questions. Real quickly, I'm Mike McCarty. I'm the CEO of Safe Hiring Solutions, Safe Visitor Solutions. Former violent crime detective with the city of Nashville, Tennessee. Started Safe Hiring about 15 years ago. We work with about 7,000 organizations across the United States. We work with thousands of public and private schools. Safe Hiring started out as a background screening firm. That's kind of the core competency. And then we've developed very specific products like Safe Visitor, RefLink, which is an automated reference checking tool. All of my experience in law enforcement and really over the past 25 years has been on the violence prevention side. So it's kind of in a unique setting with the city of Nashville, and I'll get into that in a little more detail as we get into the first few slides. Done a lot of prevention work for Department of Justice, Defense, Homeland Security, Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, and this was all based on some modeling, which we're going to talk about, that really mirrors a lot of what we're seeing within the schools today. Also have a good friend, advisory board member, one of our consultants on the call, Paul Dvorak. So, hey, Paul, I'd like to welcome you and let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Mike. Hi, everybody. As Mike said, my name is Paul Dvorak. I had 23 years of experience with the Secret Service. I just retired last year. And the way that Mike and I met was several years ago, probably a little over 4 years ago now, at a seminar. And it was regarding his background checks. And I was real impressed the way that he went about conducting background checks for various companies and schools. I haven't seen it done with that kind of thoroughness, and he wasn't missing a lot of the databases that a lot of other companies were, and he didn't get it. He didn't do it on the cheap. He gave a nice thorough, conducted a nice thorough background at a very fair price, and so that we started talking after that, became friends, and obviously, as he said, asked me to be on his advisory board, and so we've been in regular contact ever since. And I dealt with a lot of the school, and we're going to go into that a little bit later. Mike will talk about the various some of the various studies that Secret Service has done for school violence, and I would go around and talk to schools regarding that. Even willing to go through and do some walkthroughs of schools. So I'm very familiar with that setting. And my experience with the Secret Service, obviously very extensive in securing different environments. I was on the presidential detail where we would go around in advance and conduct advances for the visit of the president, make sure every building and facility was secure. So a ton of experience in that, and also in conducting investigations for potential threats against any of our protectees. And both of those two pieces, I think, can easily be applied to what everyone is trying to do in solving the school violence issue. There is a certain aspect of physical security, but there's also a big aspect of the mental health and trying to identify folks that may want to do harm, and also trying to help students that aren't even trying to do harm, that are just going through some troubled times, and identifying those kids and getting the right help for them. And I think that's where, Mike and I, a lot of people are really focused on this violence prevention and active shooter, and I mean they should be. That's a huge component and concern of everybody, but we kind of come from it from a different aspect of, not only, should you be trying to identify those kids, but how about the kids that are just going through some troubled times and they're maybe not identifying it to anybody actively? They're either embarrassed or they really just don't know how to resolve some of these issues because of their age and their environment. Well, let's try to identify those kids and get them help. I mean, if our focus is only on active shooter, we're really missing out on a huge opportunity to help some of these kids. And so Mike and I have, we take that approach to this, that there is a much bigger opportunity here than just trying to keep guns out of schools. So, but anyways, that's just a quick introduction, and we'll go into it a little bit more as we get into the slides. So thanks, Mike.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. That's exactly right. As we're working with schools across the United States, here's some of the common things that we see and we hear. Clearly, you guys all have a lot of vendor fatigue, and quite honestly, I get email updates, things that we, keywords that we keep an eye on. I see news media releases on a weekly basis. There's some new app, some new product. So trying to manage all that from the school perspective, hats off, because we know you're being inundated with all of these new products. And so, having the right kind of partner, being able to assess where do we start, where do we go, what do we need to do. I've seen schools pay recently, very large school district pay up to almost $500,000 for a physical security assessment. And so after $500,000, now you have a roadmap of things that you need to implement. And so, we want to really look at foundationally, not only where do you start, most of you have started, you're already doing things, but, what kind of wellness checkup do we need to do? Things that you can layer in, things that aren't going to cost any money. Oftentimes, when we're working with a school, we can identify things that cost absolutely no money and could be implemented very quickly that oftentimes are going to move the needle toward helping a child much more quickly than a lot of the products that are being marketed. And so, we want to also make sure we don't get just tunnel vision on active shooter. Our approach to, safety is about helping kids. It's not just about, preventing an active shooter. The end result of, good quality threat assessment, behavioral risk programs, all of the things we're going to talk about, the end product is it's going to, reduce that risk significantly. But recently, I was part of an interview with a news organization, and they looked at a specific state. And one of the things they found in this specific state, they had 2 active shooter events in the last 5 years, one of which was thwarted, meaning he did not fire a weapon on school property. The other one actually did have student and teacher shot. So they had 2 incidents in a 5-year period, but they also looked at information from the Department of Education. They pulled records on licensed employees in that state, and there were about 80 employees in that same 5-year period that had been charged with sexual misconduct within the school setting. Well, what I also noticed about those particular numbers, and I discussed in this particular news outlet, was that is only licensed employees, because in that particular state, that is the only group that Department of Ed could track. They did not track your classified or unlicensed employees, which comprise about 50% of school employees. So I said, if that's the case, then that number in a 5-year period potentially is more like 160 when you start layering in coaches and unlicensed employees. So we want to make sure we don't just tunnel on one aspect of keeping schools safe, that we keep a broad 360 approach to this. Policymakers, we know you get a lot of legislation that comes out. In different states, we see legislation coming out, mandates that you have to comply with. In a lot of these states, even sometimes the policymakers do not understand this, or they're relying on the wrong type of expertise to help them drive these policy changes. Sometimes they don't even know how to use the right terminology. We see terms used in some states related to threat assessment, which is behavioral, is the way, Paul and I and most of you would look at a threat assessment. And we see it defined that's an assessment of a school building, a physical structure. And so even the terminology that we use doesn't always fit with exactly what they're supposed to comply with in those particular states. This is a recent conversation I've had within the last 10 days from a person that leads the school resource officers in this particular state. And he had been part of a meeting where a police administrator had said, hey, our number one role in police, the number one role of police in a school is to end a shooting. And this was made to a group of policymakers that were sitting in a room. And I say that is the complete opposite approach. And that is not what the number one role of an SRO or a school officer is in that school. And quite honestly, if we're going to look at the data here in a minute, when we look at this most recent Secret Service report that came out back in November, you're going to see, I believe the numbers 50 or 51% of the active shooter events that they looked at, there was a police officer in that building. And so, sometimes, who the policymakers are relying on don't understand this prevention mindset and are looking more at it from a reactionary mindset. And then you get a lot of pressure from parents. I mean, Paul and I have worked real closely with the school that had an active shooter event, and there's enormous amount of pressure in this suburban school district from the parents. They want to see things, right? When I pull up to drop my kids off, I want to see something that shows me that my kids are going to be safe. And, for them to be able to understand that there's a lot of things that are going to happen in a school environment, especially on a prevention-based model, they're not going to be visible. It's not going to be known to the parents. They're not going to see these things. So we understand a lot of the pressures and where the pressures are coming from inside the school. Here's what I would say, where I think Paul and I, became quick and fast friends is we both come from a really prevention mindset. And the Secret Service clearly is a prevention-based law enforcement organization. Most of law enforcement is not. I come from, my dad was with the Indiana State Police. My grandfather was police. My older cousin just retired as school resource officer in the Columbus, Ohio area. I've got a brother that's a police administrator. My wife was a police officer for 20 years. I'm telling you, I got a lot of law enforcement in my background, but most policing is very reactionary. And so who we're placing in schools from a law enforcement perspective is really critical. Not just any police officer, and I think Parkland showed that to us, not just any police officer can work within the school environment or understand this prevention mindset. I come out of a model where we were facing a very similar type crisis that we see in schools today. We were looking at a very specific subset of violence in Nashville in the early 90s. What we were looking at was how many women and children were being killed on an annual basis by somebody that they were married to, was a father of, in a relationship with. So there was some kind of relationship. It was domestic violence. And we had 25 murders every single year in the city. So we started digging into this, very small group of us. And one of the things that we found was the national mindset at that time was it's a crime of passion, meaning this is, happened so quickly. Some kind of trigger, comes home, doesn't like something. How are you ever going to prevent that? So that's the mindset. It's impulsive. It's not preventable. We looked at the data, and I remember telling our administrative team, cabinet of the police department as a young 20-something-year-old police officer, that I thought it was just the opposite because the data said it was just the opposite. What the data was telling us is we're only focusing on felony cases. The only time we're intervening as a police department is when we have been out there multiple times and somebody now is being threatened or hurt at a felony level. Now we want to intervene. That's a reactionary model. We had zero community collaboration. We didn't talk to anybody. We were in silos. Healthcare did their thing. Social workers did their thing. Police department did their thing. Advocacy programs did their thing. Nobody talked together. The courts didn't interact. The prosecutors had nobody specialized in this model. There was no threat assessment or understanding of the risk behaviors inside these homes. What we did in 1994, it coincided with the passing of the Violence Against Women Act. And so in 1994, we developed the largest domestic violence prevention-based unit in the United States in Nashville. And we brought together detectives, the courts, mental health, healthcare, social worker, advocates, everybody under one umbrella. Some of them were housed within our office. Others we worked with within a team environment. Every single week, one day a week, we would have briefings, much like a threat assessment team. We would sit down where we could vet cases as a team, where you might have a prosecutor, somebody from social services, somebody from mental health, sitting at that table discussing particular cases and our intervention program and process and what we were going to do. The data showed us that as a police department, we averaged 5 to 8 calls to a home before somebody was killed. The victim had reached out on average 6 to 8 times to community partners before they ever called law enforcement the first time. So what we worked on was a model that said, hey, this is a victim that has asked for help anywhere from 11 to 16 or 17 times before they're killed. We have lots of opportunity to intervene. What we realized real quickly is there were the victims that were asking for help. If we could intervene early, connect these flags very early before it even becomes a law enforcement issue. Maybe when they're reaching out to advocacy programs, when it's a power and control issue, the earlier we intervene, the less likely somebody was to die. We cut the domestic homicide rate in Nashville by 50%. That first 10 years of this program, you literally could name 100 women or children that were alive in Nashville as a result of this program and a shifting mindset of working together, sharing information. What were the keys? We created a threat assessment or a lethality assessment tool. There's no much like school violence, there's no profile of a school shooter. There's no profile of a domestic abuser. They cross all socioeconomic levels. We focused on the behaviors because there were consistencies in these risk behaviors and be able to create the flags. And when you started to see multiple flags and tracking not only the victims, but the offenders and seeing the history and connecting these dots, then we went out and trained all 1,200 police officers on the street, everybody that's going to interact within the home that's going to be a first responder. They had to understand when they are interviewing and seeing things, they're starting to connect the dots the first time they arrive on the scene, not the 4th or 5th time they arrive on the scene. We created the threat assessment teams that I mentioned that involved all the different stakeholders from the community. So it was the early intervention, the flags, and then mandating and entering into these mental health and behavior, at this time, batterers intervention programs, providing solutions and assistance, and the end result was a reduction in the homicides. What we also found, of the 50% that were still being murdered in Nashville, one of the common denominators was, A, they were not reaching out for help, and how do we as a community raise the public awareness so they disclose, see something, say something. You can see some parallels. The other part of that group was these were individuals that may have reached out for help before, but the response was so bad that they had written off ever reaching out for help again. And I think that fits in with some stuff we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is kind of a cultural survey to understand the school environment, because one of the critical pieces here is we've got to create a trusted environment where it's students, parents, employees, whomever, feel comfortable and confident that if they see something, that they feel comfortable or confident that if they say something, that the appropriate level of response is going to be there. So, when we look at this model in Nashville, how does it, similar to when we talk about school targeted violence? Well, there's two kind of key studies here over the last couple years. First one, the FBI in 2017, you can Google this to get a copy of the report, Making Prevention a Reality, Identifying, Assessing, and Managing the Threat of Targeted Attacks. And what did they find in this particular study? They're not spontaneous. They're not emotion driven. They're not crimes of impulsivity. They're not just somebody snapping and committing these crimes. What does the Secret Service guide that just came out in November say? One of the key statements in the opening of that Secret Service guide says targeted school violence is preventable. And so these are bold statements, but I think as we work in the school environment, these should provide a lot of hope for us that if we're doing the right things, that we can intercede here and prevent some of these. So prevention's got to be the foundation. The prevention model is not punitive, but a model to help. And I think that's the mindset we have to adopt here. All these zero tolerance policies we saw pop up, decade ago, the end result of that is they move the needle in terms of safety, not a bit. And so this is not a punitive model. This is a model of help. To go back to what the police administrator said, the number one goal of a police is to stop an active shooter in a school. If we're engaging with them in the hallway, we've already lost this battle. We want to engage with them long before they even think about doing something like that. But once they get inside the school, we're already on the defensive. We've already lost this battle. We want to intersect with a child long before they've made a decision to use violence or suicide. So with the Secret Service guide, they really looked at 41 incidents of targeted school violence. And, we're going to do a really high level, just kind of what this guide, you can download it if you've not seen it, if you've not read it, you can pull it off the internet, email us, we'll send it back to you. You can read it in depth. We're going to give you the highlights of what this guide said. And what we'll see in the future is we'll probably be offering a series of webinars that really start to go more granular and really discuss, first step, second step, third steps, things to guide you along that path. But one of the things that I mentioned a minute ago, there's no profile of a student attacker. So we got to focus on the threat assessment. First of all, we have to understand what threat assessment means. And that's not talking about the physical security assessment. When we talk about threat assessment, there's several models out there, and we'll get into those in a very limited detail in this short webinar. But we can, talk about those in future webinars to talk through, what is the right modeling for threat assessment. Focusing on the student behaviors. What are the motives? The attacker had multiple motives in these 41 events, grievances with classmates being one of the top, issues with staff, romantic relationships, a desire to kill. The attackers experienced psychological, behavioral, or developmental symptoms, depression, suicidal ideations. One of the tools that I'll mention, some of you may be using this, but it's the Columbia University Lighthouse suicide model. This is free to schools. It is of no cost. And so that's an opportunity to create a standardized model of intervening as we're seeing the increase in suicides within our, youth population. Behavioral, the defiance, the misconduct. They saw relationships between ADHD and ADD. And then you're talking about some neurological or developmental delays in some of these cases. Interest in violent topics. We probably could spend the next hour, in a debate on this. A lot of good literature and information out there that could be discussed here, but 50% had of the targeted shooters had an interest in violent topics. Social stressors involving relationships. 100% experienced at least one of these social stressors within a 6-month period of the attack. 50% within 2 days of the attack. Negative home life factors, almost 100% of them. Domestic violence. We talked about the Nashville model. I could spend 3 or 4 hours talking about just the impact on a child of witnessing violence inside the home. Not a child that's physically or sexually abused, simply living in a home where they are witnessing violence and what impact it has on them as a child and juvenile justice, and what impact it has on them as an adult. That's a whole separate webinar. The bullying, and we've talked exhaustively about this, in the school setting. It should not be a surprise that most attackers were victims of bullying. 50% were victims of persistent or ongoing bullying. History of school disciplinary action, punitive measures, not prevention. And so as we go back to that, slide 2 or 3 slides ago, talking about this is not a punitive model, but a model to help. The punitive measures, like removing a student from the school, not always the safest option. And the targeted shooter exhibiting some kind of concerning behaviors, or there was some concern from others. 100% of them exhibited concerning behaviors, and most had communicated some kind of threat or had leakage prior to these events. Now, Paul, I know coming out of the Secret Service, 23, 24 years, based on, kind of what we're talking about here very quickly, just want to pass it over to you to add, some value to that.
Sure. Mike's right. So he went through a whole array of different factors that were brought up that were common in a lot of these active shooters. So schools can do this. I'm very, very confident of it. And I can tell you, like, the Secret Service's approach when we went out and investigated any threats, we just didn't talk with the person who made the threat. The layers of interviews that we would go through were pretty extensive. Particularly when as we went through it, we thought the threat was credible and more, likely, or potential of happening, not likely of happening, but potential of it. And so, we would talk through layers of that person's family, friends, workers. It would continue on until we were satisfied with, an overarching outcome of consistency. So in schools, a lot of what Mike just mentioned, well, who's going to observe these things? They're going to be different people in different roles in the school, and that's why it's important to put together a threat assessment team that covers these different layers. It just can't be principals and vice principals and longtime teachers and then maybe some of your behavioral health folks that a lot of schools are getting now, and then that's it. It can't be just that, because their interaction, high level management of these schools, they don't have the interaction necessarily that the teachers do, that the cafeteria workers do, that the bus drivers may have, right? They see these kids in much different settings. So if you're able, just like I was saying with the Secret Service, in that we try to get a wide range, we do a lot of different interviews of a lot of different people that have various contacts with this one individual. That's what schools need to do. So if you put together a threat assessment team that has a lot of these different layers and different people and different responsibilities, you're going to see a lot of the different areas in the kids. The kids on the bus are going to act much differently than they're going to act in a class, right? So So you're going to see, where some of these kids that might be troubled, they're going to show some of these signs, but they might never show these signs in a classroom setting just because they can control it. They know that, they don't want to be identified by a teacher, but they're willing to let it out, and they don't think they're being seen on a school bus or in a cafeteria. So you're able to connect the dots. I firmly believe that you can identify some of these factors, but it has to be a community effort, as Mike discussed, and not even just at the school. The parents have to get involved, and that's something that is beyond the school's control. But if we can create an environment that, like Mike said earlier, that everyone's willing, they can either anonymously or come forward and express some concerns. It doesn't mean you're going to take the kid aside and immediately talk to him and think he's got a gun in his backpack. But when you have a number of these factors and they're all coming in, then that's where some type of intervention needs to take place. I mean, maybe not an intervention, but at least an investigation. And a lot of the times it's not going to have anything to do with any kind of active shooter or, kid maybe wanting to harm anybody. The kid's going through, all kinds of stressors at home. You take Parkland, and I know we're kind of running out of time, but if anybody ever read anything about the Parkland shooting, that kid, unbelievably, he went through some traumatic events that most of us won't go through in our entire lifetime. He hit all of them by the age of 16. Parents dying, living with grandmother, being tossed around to different homes and different settings. I mean, all kinds of things that this kid, you can't expect a 16-year-old to be able to deal with that stuff. Could you prevented it? I don't know. But if you able to get to a kid like that way early and able to get them some help, that could have made the difference. And those signs were out there. They just weren't able to connect the dots. And so if you have a community aspect here, I think you can connect those dots and get those kids some help.
Which really leads right into, in the last few minutes is really, on this prevention side is, where do we start? Where do we need to focus? And I know you're being inundated with, all kinds of solutions to, make the building stronger and more secure. But we want to shift the focus to prevention. And I can tell you, if you're just starting or if you're feel like you've got everything in place, one of the most important things, and as Paul and I worked with a school that went through an event a couple years ago, one of the things that happened right after the event was they bought all kinds of different solutions. And so by the time we came in, one of the first things we did was we really did a safety climate survey. We've got a tool to do that. We've got a software. This can be done anonymously. We did it based on stakeholders, so we could group SROs, nurses, admin, students, teachers, classified, school safety specialists. We can create any number of different stakeholders. And we go through a very detailed first step is an anonymous survey that gets aggregated. And then we can do face-to-face interviews. But when we put this in front of the superintendent, she pushed everything else aside and was absolutely stunned by the information that was gathered in this particular climate survey. And I would tell you that, this is really the foundation, because we can add all kinds of different security layers, but if people don't understand policies, they don't understand procedures, they don't understand even basic things. What do I do in an emergency? Who can call 911? Basic things. What do the nurses feel versus the school resource officers versus the admin versus a teacher? And so foundationally, this can be accomplished very inexpensively, but the amount of information that can come out of this is really kind of foundationally what should drive the roadmap moving forward. You may have some systems in place. Are they being used appropriately or correctly? Are they the best? Is that what you should be using? But it helps to create the roadmap. You don't have to spend $500,000 on a security assessment to get this information, because many of the security assessments don't even focus on kind of the safety climate survey, gathering information from within the organization. And then, like Paul mentioned, developing the multidisciplinary threat assessment team or teams, depending on the size of your school. I've seen a lot of different modeling out there where you may have one team, depending on the size of the school district, or you may have teams at the building level, which makes a lot of sense. They're interacting with the kids, they know them better. And then you might have a team that it gets elevated to. So you got a level 1 threat versus a level 2 or a level 3, or however you classify it. And then implementing a threat assessment model, a standardized approach. I mentioned the Columbia Lighthouse for the suicide, but there are a number of different models. Virginia, Maryland, there's a number of these models out there. Some of them have been extraordinarily validated. Some states are using blended models. Then the implementation of the bullying prevention programs, the anonymous reporting, like Paul mentioned, being able to gather that information early and be able to connect those dots. Physical security assessments are an absolute part of this process. I'm of the mindset there's multiple ways of doing this. This can be done oftentimes by well-trained SROs, or you're working with your colleagues at different schools, and maybe an SRO from school A helps with school B, so they're getting a fresh set of eyes on this situation, and being able to do the actual physical security assessments. And then training. I mean, it's the foundation of the whole program. Again, we talked about not getting tunneled in just on the active shooter, but also thinking in terms of non-student threats. We've had incidents like in San Bernardino several years ago. It was domestic violence where teacher separated, and the estranged husband or boyfriend shows up at the school, probably walks right in the front door, says, "Hey, I need to drop something off, my wife, my girlfriend." Nobody at the school knew anything about the threats and behaviors. He walks into a classroom, kills her, and kills another student. And so looking at former students, coaches, contractors, volunteers, how all of these potential threats that, come into a school, are they being vetted properly, the access they have to children, so visitor management, volunteer management, background checks are not a one and done. We've got a new tool called Arrest Alert, which is real-time triggers when somebody gets arrested anywhere in the United States. So how are you managing the information on people that have access to the kids? Crisis alert systems. We've got partners. One of our main partners, is in thousands of schools, and it's really, once we have that prevention model in place, that does not mean we are not preparing ourselves for an event. If we had more time, I guarantee you, Paul could go into, depth talking about all the effort they put into preventing anything with a protectee, but they are more than prepared to react to something if it happens. And so being able to bring together, what are the best products to have in place and services in the event that something does get breached or happen. And so looking at the crisis alert systems. I think the big piece, and we've got mapped out here and been working with several high-level SROs, is creating kind of a information portal that we're calling TIP, where you can integrate all of your different solutions or systems into a model where the threat assessment team can now get multiple red flags. So it's not just a teacher, it's not just a counselor, it's not just a nurse, it's not just an SRO, but how do you bring all of these into one portal where now you're getting multiple flags that may be coming from multiple directions through anonymous reporting or these different tools, and now being channeled to the threat assessment team to be able to take that information and respond appropriately based on that information. So I know we covered a ton of information extraordinarily fast. We've got multiple upcoming learning opportunities. We'll be sending out more information where we may take some of these topics and go into a more granular look at some of the individually, like a threat assessment tool or models. I wanted to give you, quick contact information here. You certainly can post a question, be happy to answer those. I know we're running up on the end of our time here, but you can also reach out. This is my direct email. It's my direct line. Give me a call, shoot me an email. Happy to answer. This is recorded, so we will send out a link. So, it'll have the slides if anybody on your team would like to, review the recording, that you'll have access to that. We've got one more. We'll repeat this again next Thursday at the same time as well. Otherwise, we appreciate taking time out of your day. We know you're extraordinarily busy, but more than happy to help or answer any questions you have. So have a great day.